It seems to be all-consuming, but it also demonstrates that things that we think are in a rearview mirror all of a sudden reappear right in front of us. And that's how we have to put in perspective the need for an investment and the right leadership in biodefense. We have new adversaries every day that enter the game, and they look for the fastest, cheapest, most effective way to produce a threat. I might also remind you that a lot of that comes naturally. As I walked over here, though, and listened to your description of accomplishments, it proves to you what you can do on the Hill if you've got good staff. But I also reflected back to 16 years ago and asked myself how many staff members on the Hill today were here then. Probably less than 20% of the staff. So it made me understand that reauthorization is not an automatic process for the staff members that are serving many members of the House and the Senate, that they likely were under 18 years old on 9/11. They don't remember the debate that happened here relative to BioShield. They probably were just coming out of college when the first reauthorization happened, and now they're a seasoned staffer on the Hill, having not participated in any of the debate. So I think it's appropriate for me to spend just a second sort of telling you why we created BioShield, what our frame of mind was, and what led us to go to PAPA. I liken this to a story I heard about a young lady who was a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and she had a life's ambition to be a school teacher. And on Chapel Hill, you graduate on a Sunday, and she went across the stage on a Sunday, and she got that diploma. She was from Eastern North Carolina, and when she got that diploma, she immediately went home and started interviewing for a school teacher's job. Third superintendent she stopped and saw offered a job as a third grade teacher. And she spent all summer, she couldn't wait for that hot August day so she could go in. She had her seating chart ready, and she was ready to fill in every child's first name. She knew that the most important thing was as fast as she could to learn their names. And she started around the room, and she was filling in the chart, and she got halfway around. And this little boy stood up, and she said, "What's your first name?" And he said, "Damn it." And she was a little bit thrown back. She said, "What's your full name?" He said, "Damn it, Jones." Well, she graduated from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She could handle this. She said, "Does your mother pick you up in the afternoon?" He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "After school, come and see me. I'd like to see your mother." So sure enough, he came up, and they went down to the car, and the teacher knocked on the car window, and this poor woman rolled the window down, and she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I meant to come talk to you. He was my 9th child. It was the only thing that came to mind." Well, she knew she was going to have to deal with this all year long. Well, about 3 months later, superintendent's out visiting schools. And he happened to be visiting that school. He remembered this young school teacher he had hired, and he wanted to go into her classroom and see how the kids were doing. She decided she was going to have a spelling bee. She had a very talented group of third graders. She started calling out names, words, and they were raising their hand. They'd gone 9 for 9. Superintendent, visibly impressed. She thought, now's the time to quit. She turned to go back to the blackboard. Sure enough, there was "Damn it" with his hand up. She looked at him and she said, "Young man, what do you want?" He said, "I'd like to spell chrysanthemum." She said, "Damn it, you can't spell chrysanthemum." At which time the superintendent jumped up and said, "Why the hell don't you let him try?" That's where we were. We had a need in the federal government. We had a need in America to produce medical countermeasures for threats that we saw. We looked at big pharma, and there was no movement. But we had a lot of innovators, a lot of small companies that were saying, "Hey, why the hell don't you let us try? Let us spend some time with you telling you what the difficulties are, the pathway. Make the pathway clear for us." We identified and termed this phrase the valley of death. That point an innovator gets to where they've got promising data, they know where they want to go, but they don't have the funding to make it through that clinical side of it. So we looked at PAPA and realized that we could structure, for the lack of a better word, a public VC company. a venture capital fund that funded that valley of death so that innovators had a understanding of the technologies. Their technology was certified as potentially meeting the need that we had, and we gave them the runway to get there. And I think Papa gave us the predictable pathway of an accelerated process of trials and hopefully approval. Well, today, BARDA has had 34 successful MCMs through the system. And we've done that even with the limitations that were put on BioShield from a standpoint of our ability to acquire those particular things at the end of the process. Nobody's happier than I am, Tom, that the administration's come around and they've basically said we're going to fund $5 billion over the next 10 years. But I got to share with all of you, it doesn't happen just with money. It takes two additional things. It takes leadership and it takes commitment. I think for the first time in a long time, we've got the leadership in place at all levels. We will always have a problem in the executive branch, I don't care who makes it up, at making sure that medical countermeasures raised to a level that requires a financial commitment. So I'm glad that maybe we won't have to revisit that for a 10-year period if we can get the advanced funding. But I can't tell you how much commitment and leadership all the way down the pipeline are to the success of the program. It is the folks at BARDA, it's Rick Bright, and his ability to bring people in and assure them that we're a partner. And I can't stress this enough. This does not look like the historical FDA model. There's an FDA component to it. But up till the time that you go through that, and I would tell you that even through the FDA process, it is a partnership between the public sector and the private sector. And the American people are the beneficiaries of it. I don't think you will have any company say, we became rich participating in this program. What we hoped and what we've seen through the creation of BARDA and this pathway is that we've got new innovative companies who create new technological platforms that, yeah, they may be they may be producing a product that goes for a particular threat that we have on our matrix, but they've also created a platform that could potentially treat 6 different types of cancer, could begin to address certain things that we haven't had an alternative to today. I'm not sure the FDA would publicly say it, but some of the folks that are in the pipeline at BARDA in development have actually been called into the game where we had no countermeasure for a particular type of disease that hit, and they asked them to produce it to save kids' lives. That's happened just about every year for the past 5. We wouldn't have that ability if it wasn't for BioShield and it wasn't for Papa and it wasn't for the creation of BARDA. And now I think we've got in place the overall leadership that we need to grow this in to something that becomes much more permanent from a standpoint of its impact and its mark on, I think, government and the private sector. Our goal when we started with Papa was to foster innovation in the private sector through clarity of need, financial partnership, and that accelerated pathway. Commitment is always going to be something that is a requirement by people like me to go out and hold administrations accountable, to hold agencies accountable, to work with agencies on correcting leadership problems, which is a function that Congress likes to get involved in way too much, but in this particular case, I think is way too important. The opportunity to make this permanent, to embed it in statute, and that's the challenging thing, is how much of what we've been provided now with this leadership from the White House can we put in statute in a way that we don't have to worry every 16 years whether the brain trust of the United States Congress, you that are staffers, remember or were even here when we had the debate, but that you can look at the successes of what we did and say, what we should do is continue programs that are successful because they provide value, they provide certainty. I think this is particularly important right now because I would suggest to you in my day job of chairman of the Intelligence Committee that we're getting ready to go through a decade of disruption. Disruption that for many in this room is not going to be foreign because you grew up using a device in your pocket. And Tom and I grew up at a time where we called somebody and asked them to do something for us. It will come natural for many of you, but it will happen at an accelerated pace that none of us understand today. Our ability to adjust and adapt and to take advantage of it is our ability to forget the historical procedural markers that are in place that have driven American society for so long, and accept the fact that if we don't allow innovators to innovate in this country at the pace that they can anywhere else in the world, a predictable thing will happen. They will leave here. So it is absolutely crucial whether we're talking about the healthcare space and biodefense or whether we're talking about Department of Defense or whether we're talking about any other area of our economy. We've got to make sure that the architecture that we've got in place is not one where the limiting factor to success is government itself. We've got to position government and all agencies of government to be a partner in the success of where innovators and technology allow us to go. And I would tell you that from a standpoint of healthcare, as political and partisan as it can be, and we had one of those debates, I think, earlier this year, my belief that in 2 years from now, that debate is irrelevant. Because if we do this right, we will have overcome everything that was an obstacle to finding a common ground. Because there will no longer be a separation between rural and urban delivery of health care, because most of it will be generated right here. That's what's possible, but I would tell you our success with designing, reauthorizing PAPA, funding the effort, driving innovation, is also important to making sure that what we can do with this device is in fact reality. So if I have any takeaway from what I talked about, it's that this is much bigger in my book than just a biodefense issue. This is about creating the framework for how over the next 10 to 20 years, the United States partners with private innovators to produce things that benefit society, our economy, our people. So, Tom, I thank you and Judd Gregg for the leadership on this. It takes a strong person to have a partnership with Trent Lott. I understand that. Hopefully he doesn't sing to you like he used to sing to us. But I really respect leaders that leave the institution I serve in and stay here to continue to do good for the American people. And I think Judd Gregg and Tom Daschle are two of those individuals that I hold in tremendous regard. I admitted to him before I came up, I spend most of my day trying to figure out how the hell I never come back here when I leave. I will get over that, I'm sure. But for the time that I am here, I'm committed to make sure that we put together the internal partnership in Congress to make sure we maximize the policies that affect the American people with a public-private partnership that everybody looks back on and says, this is one of those success stories that we will highlight. With that, can I take some questions? I'd be happy to take questions or dance around them or shove them to Tom. Yes, ma'am.
Senator Burr, first of all, thank you for your years of commitment and service and leadership on this. You talk about the critical importance of partnering with the industry, with the innovators on the science side. Do you see a model that's more based on co-investment, innovators on the financial side, the investors that are co-investing, along with the significant government commitments that are being made in BioShield?
My answer would be I wouldn't leave anything off the table, because I think part of government's responsibility to taxpayers is to leverage federal money where we can leverage it. I think it was impossible for us to go from the typical VC injection of cash that we saw 14 years ago to a partnership on the financial side that is possible today, and we see examples of it beginning to emerge, and some of that's even coming out of federal investments in NIH. BART is a great example. So I think we're going to look at ways to do that in the future. That's really going to be more an internal process. I think that the way things are written, the ability is there to structure deals that way. And I think we do have the leadership that can begin to do that. I just want to stress that this is a period where we have to keep our foot on the gas. We cannot throttle back. We've got to have it all the way to the floorboard, because the innovator market, whether that's big pharma, small pharma, bio, wherever it is, needs to know that we're going to be successful. I can understand that there's some that may not want to play in the space because of the limited markets that Tom talked about. But my belief is we're headed into a period of time where it will be the technology platforms that are created, producing medical countermeasures, where nobody knows where else that platform may have a market-based application. So we're about building technology and platforms in the future, and it may be that we're the impetus to have that platform launch, and there's some of them in the pipeline right now, where there's great hope that we're going to be able to produce other medical solutions off of that same platform. It's exciting. It's way above my pay grade, though. It's a free shot at me, I'd take it. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for being here. You just mentioned other medical solutions. Thank you. You just mentioned other medical solutions that could come up, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on expanding the BioDefense program to include non-strategic threats. And I'm speaking specifically of antimicrobial resistance or natural outbreaks like H7N9, avian flu, those kinds of things.
You're trying to get me in a fight with Tony Fauci this morning, aren't you? Listen, the great thing is we've been able to enhance the scope of where BARDA could be over time, because it was the best option that we had to explore expansion of needs. And some of that was in the antibiotic area. What I don't want to do is I don't want to get it so broad that we're in competition with other areas of research in the federal government. And I think that the next phase, rather than massive expansion of jurisdiction, would be federal partnerships, which influenza is a great example of where that has been an ongoing federal partnership between BARDA where appropriate and Tony Fauci and NIH. I think if you look at an example that was called in but not planned was Ebola, where it encompassed more than just NIH and BARDA. They were all at the table trying to figure out how to bring what they needed to the table in a very expedited fashion. We learned more from that on the hospital and response side than probably we did anywhere else. But I would just take you back to Ebola and remind you that Ebola was one of the targeted infectious diseases. And at some point, somebody made a decision. Let's shelve what we got. Let's not run this through to the end because we've got other things that are more important. When you got a targeted list of things, you can't shelve things, you can't prioritize them because most of that list, we don't know when it's going to happen. And as we begin to look at intentional threats, I become more and more concerned with what I see every day because of the actions of those that I am most concerned with as adversaries and what potentially they can do. It was described to me this week that a biology major with a C as a grade can take what's available online today and be a tremendous risk to the United States and to the world, and that's an accurate statement. Yes, ma'am.
With the funding now potentially available, waiting for the next, thank you, for the next few weeks, what do you see as our greatest bottleneck in moving what's been some great innovation and early development into readiness?
I stated, Lamar Alexander was nice enough to let me chair both the hearings. We're at least notionally targeting sometime in April to mark up the bill. And I said at the beginning of the first markup, the only thing that stands in the way of us in reauthorization is a deep desire by members of the committee or members of Congress to take a simple bipartisan reauthorization and understand that we're opening up an act and that they see this as a train leaving the station and they want to put all sorts of other policy things in it. If that happens in today's atmosphere, it makes it extremely tough to get across the goal line because not only are we trying to manage a Senate process, we have to game out a House process. So the question is, who goes first? What do you do? Do you put certain things in here? You might know that it's the intentions of the administration. They've noted it to move the management of the stockpile back to HHS. I think that's a good thing. That's how I originally envisioned it. Had we had somewhere to put it back then, other than CDC, we might have put it somewhere differently. But it makes a tremendous amount of sense to take those individuals who most understand the pipeline, most understand the process that these countermeasures went through, to be in charge because the lead time for a majority of the replacement units that we need in the national stockpile is somewhere between 12 and 18 months. And if I'm relying on somebody that wasn't part of that process, they may assume that when 10 million doses expire, that this is like calling the drugstore and getting a reload. This takes a tremendous amount of planning, and I think that as we have seen over the life of the stockpile, we've got a unique partnership with DOD relative to anthrax vaccines, where we don't do two separate acquisitions, or at least I don't think we are now. They're pulling out of the stockpile so we don't have expiration problems on things that we keep for the American people. And let me just say, anthrax is a great example because we've gone from basic development. Was it egg-based originally? And now we're in cell-based. The same transition we're making on influenza. I'm not sure we could have done that if we hadn't had DOD out there pounding on the process saying this has got to happen. And I think our innovators were actually in competition with the researchers at DOD in this particular case. So everywhere you look in the process, there's a success story. There's a reason that having it structured the way that it is has been beneficial. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'll leave you with the words of George Bush Sr., the old guy, 41, when he stood on the west steps of the United States Capitol on the day he was inaugurated, and he said this: "We're not the sum of our possessions. They're not the measure of our lives. In our hearts, we know what matters. We cannot hope only to leave our children a bigger car or a bigger bank account. We must hope to give them a sense of what it means to be a loyal friend, a loving parent, a citizen who leaves his home, his neighborhood, and his town better than he found it." I truly believe that what we're doing with the reauthorization of PAPA, with the creation of BioShield, with the commitment to continue these, isn't benefiting us, isn't benefiting the company, it's benefiting the American people long term, because it gives us options that would not exist if it wasn't for these programs and an unbelievably talented group of people. Thank you very much.